In the previous video, we created an index page that allows us to retrieve the rows of the stock categories and put them in a simple table like this one. Now we are going to continue the process and create a data entry form such that if we click this button, we'll be provided with this simple form, and it also includes validation. When we hit the save button, it will give us a nice error message below the box telling us that this field is required. So before we start coding, let's take a look at the behind the scenes scenario. So we have here a stock category form, and we must also build a corresponding object. So that's a form object with ID, description, type, and stock account, such that every item or every entry that we put in these boxes will be reflected to the appropriate properties of the object. And if we are going to access this object, we write it in this kind of notation, form dot description, of course referring to the description portion. If we look at it closely, this is just a key and a value pair. So the key is the ID, the value is null. The key is type, the value is F, which represents the finished goods. All right? The entries in the stock category form, as I mentioned, should be binded to an object similar to this one. So this form object will be the one that will be passed on to the controller, and eventually it will be saved on to the stock categories table. But do take note that in the stock categories table, we already have some rules that were defined for this table, such as the description should be a varchar, the type should be enumerated, which have a value of either F, R, and D. Other than that, it will issue an error. So in the database side alone, if you are going to enter values that are not within this data type and that are not within this length and other rules that were set forth, then your database server will return an error. So that's why it is important that before the values that are entered in the stock category form reaches the table, it should have been validated so that we could capture the error and issue it in a nicely formed flash messages or error messages. Yeah, instead of having this kind of error. So let's move on. So what we are going to do is the view plus the controller. So the view is something like this. We have here a template which will contain the HTML and the CSS part, and then below it is the JavaScript, particularly in Vue.js. At this point, what we need to do is to have an object that will be binded to this form. And once this is done, once we hit the save button, this object will be submitted or passed on to this store method of the stock category controller via the request parameter. And then this is the validation script. If you read at it, the ID is required, and at the same time, it should be unique from the stock categories. So no double entry for the primary key, and it should be numeric. So that is our validation rule for the ID. And similarly, if you look at the others, the description, the type, both of them are required, whereas the stock is nullable. So meaning no entries, it's fine. Okay. So if it's validated, it will proceed to these next statements where you create a new model and then assign the values to that model and then eventually save it to the record. When everything goes wrong, it will redirect us to the index page with a success message of, say, stock category is created. Otherwise, if there is an error, this particular script here will generate an errors object. Take note with S, errors object, and it will be submitted back to the create view. So we should be able to capture that errors message via props, right? Let us start by building the form first. If you look at it, the elements are stacked on top of each other. So this is a good candidate for a flex column. Each element occupies the entire row. So what we will be doing is we will divide this into subsections. One group is the ID, the text box, and the error label that will come after this. So that will be one group, another group for the description, and another group for the type, stack, and one for the save. So the form will just be 1/3 of the screen and it should be centered. If we look at the stack category controller, in the create section, we have here a code that will render the stack category create. So at this point, we don't have that yet. Let's check that on the resources. JavaScript, pages, stack categories. So we don't have a create view yet. So we will create one new file and then create dot view. Okay. So here we create the skeleton. We have now a nice skeleton, but I don't need some of it. I don't need this at this point. I don't need the return. I don't need the style. So this is just the skeleton that I need at this point. So we have the template on top and then the script at the bottom and then the export default plus this is your new composition API setup. Okay. Notice that we have a div already here. This is a what we call a root container. So every template needs a root container. So let's just leave that as it is for now. So let's import the layout. So the layout is actually coming from here, the layouts, and that is the authenticated. Okay, if I'm going to use this authenticated component in this template, it will be called layout. That's what I prefer. Shortcut for authenticated, at least. Now, to use that, I have to declare that inside my component section of the script. So, components, colon, open and close, and then comma sign. Okay? So, the comma sign meaning this section, there will be another section that comes after this, which is the setup. Okay, so if there's anything that comes after the setup, you put a comma sign after. So even if there's none, it's good to put already. So just in case there will be, there's no need to add one. So the component that I need is the layout. Again, it's the same story. I will put a comma sign beside it. Right, now I'm ready to use this layout right here. I'll put here a layout and then here stack form here. So we expect the stack form to appear right in this portion. So I'm gonna save that for the meantime and then check at my browser. Okay, so if I hit on the create button, it should bring me to that page, right? So I have the layout already in place and I have my stack form right there. So we're going to build one container here, one big container, and it should be a flex container such that anything that you put inside this big container will be centered here. So the form will be another container that will just occupy about 1/3 of the space. Okay, so we need two big containers, one for this main gray area and one that will contain the form. So let's do that. Okay, so we're gonna enclose this stack form with another div. Okay, let me tab that properly. And then this should be a flex and it should be justified and it should occupy the entire available width of the screen. Okay, the next will be for the form. Okay, so this class, the background of this will be white. Let's have a background of white. This should be a flexible column, a flexible container. and the width should only be, and it's a flex column because all the elements will be stuck on top each other. The width should only be 1/3 of the screen, and let's put some margin beside it, so about 20 units margin. Okay, right. So we have your stock form here. Now we are ready to build the elements that we need. All right, first will be the label. Gonna put an H2 stock category form. Yeah, then maybe large. And then below it is the form. So let's create a form. Now the form for now, it needs an ID, and the name should be the same. So let's call that a stock form. So that's it for now. And inside it, the elements that we need. So first, I need a label for ID, and the text box itself. It's an input. Okay, it's a type text. Of course, we always add an ID for reference. We add also a name. And then last, we have the error. So the error should be in another div. Okay. Let's just say error here. Save. So we have a label on top, and then the form with one input group. So let's look at the code. Now we have already this input group, but they are not arranged together, but at least it's here. So we have here the label. So what we need to do now is to put a padding surrounding this form, and then a space here, and then make these three elements stack up on top of each other, and then we could replicate, right? Okay, so let's remove the stack from here already. It had served its purpose. So the first thing we will do is to add some padding on the outer container for the form. So padding of about 6 probably. And then these three elements that we have here, let's put them inside another container so that they will be stuck up together. Okay? Patong-patong sila. So we have div. Okay? Let me format that. Okay? And then it should be a flex column, and it should be let's put a margin on top, a padding on top of about 6. So there's a space between the stock category and this group of input elements. Save, and then let's see that. Okay, so it looks better. So the last thing that we are going to do is to change the color of this into red, and then we are ready to copy this entire group elements or input group elements and replicate that 4 times. So the error should have a class of text that is red, and I'm gonna choose 700, and then it should be smaller. That's so big for an error, so SM. Okay, one more check. Okay, so now we have a nice red color error message here. Okay, so we're done with the design. Now we copy this 3 times for our category and stock account. So copy 1, 2, 3, 4. So there are 4 of them. The second one is the description. Okay, so this is for the ID description. The third one is, we will leave this as blank. This is for the select type. And the fourth one, this is for our stock account. So this is the stock account. Okay, so let's give an ID that is unique, stock account. Copy that. Same name and ID. Right. So it looks good. Save and check. Two more and we're done. So first, we're going to change this into a drop-down box using the select, and we will add a submit button right below the stock account. So on the third, 1, 2, 3. So this is the third one. I'm gonna remove this input here. Instead of an input, it should be a select. So this is the type, and this is for your type. I'm going to create a select box. The name is type. The type is type, or the ID is type. And then we will have options here. Option, the value is F. This is for your finished goods. Okay. One more. Option, the value is R for raw materials. And another option for dummy. Okay. And format again. Then finally, we add the label. No, the button right here. So we copy this. And div. And add the button. The button. The type should be submit. And let's add some color to that button. So let's call that as background indigo again. And the text should be white. Can be seen. Of course, don't forget the label save. The next thing to do is to create the object that will be bounded to these elements here. So we will have a form object with properties ID, description, type, and stock account. Then we will also have the errors object that will be generated or passed to this page by the stock controller whenever there are errors during validation, right? So let's do that. Let me just add a padding to the button, padding -2 so that it looks better. And then let's go down and create the props. Right. So after the components, another section of this export default part is the props. It may come first or next after the component. It doesn't matter as long as they are all inside the export default. So props, colon, open and close, and then comma sign. Okay, so that's the code. So we are expecting to receive an object called errors. So this is errors, and the type is object. I'll put a comma sign in case there will be other objects or elements that follows after it. Right, that's the first. Second, inside the setup, this is where we will declare the variables that we need. Okay, the setup by default, it accepts the props. So that means these props here, anything that is inside can be accessed here or can be used here. So I'm going to declare the form. So the form will be a constant. It's a form equals, it's an object. Right. So that's the syntax. So inside this, we define the properties for that. So we have an ID. By default, it should be null, followed by description. Okay, so by default again, just make it null. And then type. So by default, it's F. And finally, stock account. By default, it's null. Right, so that makes up for our form. Now, we are going to bind this into our components. So input type components. So let's go ahead and bind that here. In the first input, this is for our ID. Let's bind that using a V model. this is already a JavaScript code, v model binded to form.id. So let's do that for the rest of the input elements. So the v model here is form that description for the select, and then the last is input. So the v model form that stack account. So we are done binding the object form here. Now we are going to bind the errors. So whenever there is an error, or there will be errors that will be accepted by this page, it should be reflected right to where it belongs to. So right here, it should not be errors here, but rather whatever will be the content of your errors dot, is this ID? Yeah, ID. Okay, so the same thing with your other errors. Let me remove that, put a mustache, and then errors dot description. Let me just copy that and then paste it. Type, then stack account. Okay, so we are good with the binding as well as the errors. Let me just check that one more time. There's nothing expected to be an output here. Just the, so we have an error, control I. So let's see what the error is. Cannot read the property ID of undefined. How is that? Yeah, okay. So this is very important. So we have an error, cannot read the property of ID. In fact, the rest of it, including the description and the account. So how is that? If you are going to define a variable or an object, such as this one, so this is an object, it has to be exposed in the return portion. So we have to say here form. In that way, we are telling this script that this particular object form can now be accessed in the template. So anything that you wanted to be accessed right here should be included in the return. No? I'm talking about the section, setup section only. The props is already exposed, no need to do that. So the errors, you could use that in the template because it's not part of this setup, right? So let's check that one more time. Okay, so I don't have an error. So I have here a good form. So the errors are not here because it's not present, because at this point we don't have, the object is still empty. Before we program the save button, let me just show you the reactive feature of Vue 3. So right now, if I'm going to put something here, if I'm going to type something here, then whatever you type here, and as you type something from here, it should be reflected already in its appropriate form. So vice versa, whatever happens here, if you're going to change the value of this object, it should also be reflected back to this form. So because they are bounded, or they are binded together, so whatever happens here, it should be reflected here. And to achieve that, we are going to create a what we call a reactive portion. So first, I'm gonna turn off the autocomplete of this because it's blocking my view. The autocomplete is off. I will do that for the description too. Okay. Now, below this one, I'm going to put this one, ID. I just type it. So let me put an ID, form.id. So that means this mustache, again, this will display the value of the form ID. Whenever I type something there, there should also be something that will come out in this specific spot. So let's do that. refresh. So if I type 1001, you see there's nothing that comes here because they are not yet reactive. So to do that, we have to enclose this, turn this one into reactive. That's the very reason why the editor suggested that I'll be using reactive here from view. So let's actually use that one and enclose this. So let's enclose that reactive, open, and then close right there. Okay, so we expect now that this object is reactive with respect to the container right here that uses that one. Okay, the input type. So let's take a look at it. Refresh. Now, if I'm going to type 1001, so you can see the output is reflected here. So it's now reactive. Okay, so the values here also changes. All right. So moving on, let's create a functionality for the save. So what it will do, let's see, take a look at it. If you click this submit button, it actually refreshes. Try to notice this once again. So if I'm going to hit the save button, look at the URL. It changes here. Let me put a value 1005 and then save. Yeah, it actually refreshed. No, you did not notice it. So we don't want that to happen. So we have to prevent the submission, and we will take care of the submission itself, not HTML. So let's do that here. So in the form, we will say on submit. So v on submit that prevent and call submit method. So let me repeat. So on submit, yeah. So on submit prevent, we will call the submit function. We will still make that or create that below in the script. So let's go down and create the submit button right here in the setup. So you can choose anywhere you want it. So let me do that maybe just in the middle na lang. Okay. So I will say constant submit equals of parentheses. That's the syntax. Okay. So this is the arrow syntax. It's a modern syntax for JavaScript, and then semicolon. That's how you make a function. Okay. So here is the function. In between these are parameters we don't have at this point. So what we will do is to simply submit the form. This form already contains everything that is being typed in the form. So we will submit that using inertia. Okay. So inertia that post, and then it will call a root which is called sc.store. Okay. And we will pass on a parameter which is the form right there. Okay, so very simple. So if you hit the submit button, we will call the store method of this stock category and submit this form. So this is that form. Now again, if you are going to use the submit on top, it has to be exposed here. So you have to type it here. Submit. Okay. Now, before we call the stock category controller, let's examine it. So the stock category is right here. It's empty. I just say dd store, sc store. So we know that we have already reached this portion if we see this text on the screen. Going back, we missed one thing. If you're going to use inertia, don't forget to import it here. Let's import something from inertia, located at inertia.js. Right, so we're good to go. Let's go back on top. So if we hit the submit button, hit the submit button, this form will be prevented from submitting. However, it will call the submit function right below here, and this will be the one that will be executed, which is it will post our form to the SE store. Okay, refresh, put something in here. Let's leave the description blank, and then like that, and then save. Okay, let me go to the console so that we could see if there are errors. Save. Right, so we're here on the store, and that's a good sign already that our form is functioning. Let us go back to the slide and examine the code for the store. So we have here a validation portion, and then when everything is okay, we create a new stock category, assign the values in it, and then when it's okay, when we are ready, we save. So when it's good, we redirect it to somewhere else, probably in the index or on the same place, right? So let's do this and build that in the stock category. Okay, so the first thing, let's erase that one, and then let's create a validate variable. Is equals to the request. So this is the variable request that we are checking. So we are validating the request and invoke the validate method, and then close, comma. So inside it is an array of elements. So if it's an array, it's actually in a bracket. The first element is your ID. The first element is your ID, which is required. The second is your description, which is also required. And then the type and stack account, where the stack account is nullable. So meaning if it's nullable, it allows null values, obviously. Now we have introduced a new thing here, which is the validation portion. So each item will be validated with some validation rules. So just like required or nullable. So what are these validation rules? Let's go ahead and check the documentation. So here is an example of validation method from the Laravel website. So here the title is required. At the same time, it is unique, meaning there is no duplicate primary, there is no duplicate value for the title in the post table, and it will only allow a maximum of 255. Here, we could actually chain together several rules for just one item. And you are most likely going to do that in many cases. So what are the things that we could use? What are the validation rules? So let's look at that. We have the available validation rules here. So we have accepted, we have email, we could also use numeric, no, and many more, right? So if you use numeric, simple, you just add the word numeric beside as a rule. Let's do that. So here, the ID, instead of being required, then it should also be numeric. Right. So next, we're done with the validation. Let's go with the creation of the model. Okay. So before we do that, let me bring you again to the documentation. In the documentation, there are many ways where you could create, insert a new model. So the first step is to create a new model. So whatever is that model, and then assign the values from the request coming from here. So we will assign it one by one, and then when you are done, we are going to save. So we will use this process in our activity. Don't forget the new sign. So there's a new stock category, and then each item ID is equals to from the request, which is also your ID. So we will repeat this process, right? And then finally, we save the model. Model, that's saved. If you don't have this line, the new record will not be inserted, Right. And then finally, what would you like to do if everything is okay? It's validated, the model is created, and then finally save. What would you like to do? Okay. So what we wanted to do is to return back to the same page, return back uh, with success. Okay. So the value of the success is new stock category. So this will create a new object called success. We will watch out for this variable and it will return back to the calling page. So that means we will go back to the form, right? So let's check that out. Save. Oh, hindi ko alam bakit, right? Uh, so let's check. 100 uh 10075. Description is Lotus Grinder. And finished goods stock account is GL 1001. Save. Okay. It actually saved. Okay, let's recap. So in the view components under the template section, we created the layout, and then we created a form object, and then binded this form object using V model here. So each item is bounded to the form object, and at the same time we added an error, so this will only be visible if there is an error. And then we prevented the form to be submitted so that it will call our own submit function, which is right below here. And that submit function will post it to the store. It actually calls the store function of the stock category controller. We use here inertia so that it will not refresh the entire page. And then in the category, store category method, we validated the items. So we know that we could chain together several rules, and if it's okay, it will proceed on to the next line. So therefore we created a new stock category and assigned the values from the request to your models here, and then we save it. Once it's done, it goes back to the same page and returns back with this message. Okay, so we haven't really used this message so far, so that will be part of the next video. Okay, so that's it, and see you again on our next videos. Again, enjoy coding.